Captain Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the exploration vessel Defiant Dawn, watching the blue and brown planet grow larger on the main screen. Kepler 442c looked peaceful from space, but the readings from their sensors told a different story. The planet should have been quiet, with only a small mining operation according to the galactic records. Instead, their instruments showed massive industrial activity and thousands of life signs concentrated in specific areas. Sarah had been exploring space for 15 years. She knew what normal mining operations looked like, and this was not normal. The energy signatures were too big, the heat patterns too concentrated, and there were far too many ships coming and going from the planet's surface. Lieutenant Kim, scan those facilities again, Sarah ordered. Something's not right here. Lieutenant David Kim worked at his console, his fingers moving quickly over the controls. The young officer had joined her crew 6 months ago, fresh from the academy on Earth. He was eager and smart, but he had never seen anything like what their sensors were picking up. Captain, I'm reading over 50,000 life signs in what appears to be enclosed compounds, Kim reported. The structures look like, well, they look like prison camps, ma'am. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. The Terran Federation had spread across 73 star systems in the past 2 centuries, and they had only one law that applied everywhere humans went. No sentient being could be enslaved, trafficked, or held against their will. It was the one rule that every human colony, every human ship, and every human citizen was bound to follow and protect. The law had come from humanity's own dark history. Earth had seen enough slavery, enough suffering, enough people treated like property. When humans finally reached the stars, they had made a promise. Never again would they allow any thinking being to be bought, sold, or owned by another. Take us into a closer orbit, Sarah commanded. But keep us hidden behind that moon. I want detailed scans of those facilities. The Defiant Dawn moved silently through space, using the small moon's gravity to mask their approach. Sarah's crew worked quietly, gathering data and images from the planet below. What they found made Sarah's blood run cold. The compounds were definitely prison camps. Thousands of beings from dozens of different species were being held in terrible conditions. The buildings were overcrowded, the sanitation was poor, and armed guards patrolled the perimeters. Worse, the scans showed that many of the prisoners were humans. Captain, Kim said quietly, I'm picking up work details being moved from the camps to the mining sites. They're chained together, ma'am. This is definitely slavery. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. In all her years of exploration, she had never encountered anything like this. She had heard stories, of course. There were always rumors of illegal slave operations in the outer systems, far from the major trade routes and government patrols. But to find it happening on this scale with humans among the victims was shocking. Who's running this operation? Sarah asked. Her communications officer, Ensign Maria Santos, checked the ship registries and planetary records. According to the official files, this is a Zaphirian syndicate mining operation. They have legal permits from the local sector government. Sarah knew about the Zaphirians. They were a powerful alien species that controlled dozens of star systems and had huge influence in galactic politics. They were known for their business skills and their ability to make deals with anyone. What she was seeing now explained how they had become so wealthy so quickly. Ma'am, we need to contact Terran Command immediately, Lieutenant Kim said. This is a clear violation of human law. Sarah nodded, but before she could give the order, alarms began blaring throughout the ship. 3 large Zaphirian warships had appeared from behind the planet, moving fast toward their position. They've detected us, Santos reported. They're demanding we leave the system immediately. Open a channel, Sarah ordered. The main screen showed a Zaphirian officer. The alien's scaled face showed no emotion as it spoke in perfect English. Human vessel, you are in restricted space. Depart immediately or face the consequences. This is Captain Sarah Chen of the Terran Federation vessel Defiant Dawn, Sarah replied firmly. We have detected illegal slavery operations on the planet below. This is a violation of human law and we demand immediate access to investigate. The Zaphirian's eyes narrowed. You have no authority here, human. This is Zaphirian space operating under legal permits. Leave now. Those are human citizens being held against their will, Sarah said, her voice getting harder. The Terran Federation has the right to protect its people anywhere in the galaxy. You have 30 seconds to change course, the Zaphirian replied. After that, we will consider you hostile. Sarah looked at her crew. The Defiant Dawn was an exploration ship, not a warship. They had defensive shields and some weapons, but nothing that could match 3 Zaphirian battlecruisers. But she also knew her duty. The law was clear and the evidence was overwhelming. "Record everything we've found," Sarah ordered. "Send it to our probe and launch it toward the nearest Terran outpost. Make sure the data gets home." "Captain, they're powering weapons," Kim warned. "Do it now," Sarah said. The small probe launched from the ship, accelerating quickly toward the edge of the system. It would take weeks to reach the nearest human outpost, but the data would eventually get to Earth. The evidence of what was happening here would not die with them. "Human ship, you have violated our warning," the Zaphirian said. "Prepare to be destroyed." The 3 warships opened fire. The Defiant Dawn's shields flared as energy beams struck them. Sarah's ship shook violently as the defensive system struggled against the massive firepower. "Return fire," Sarah ordered, even though she knew it was hopeless. The exploration ship's small weapons did little damage to the heavily armored Zaphirian vessels. The enemy ships spread out, surrounding the human vessel and continuing their attack. The Defiant Dawn's shields began to fail. "Hull breach on Deck 3, Kim reported. "We're losing life support in sections 4 through 7. "Emergency power to shields," Sarah commanded, but she knew they only had minutes left. The ship shook again as another volley hit them. Sparks flew from damaged consoles and the lights flickered. Sarah could smell smoke in the air and hear the sound of metal being torn apart. "Captain, the engines are failing," Santos called out. "We're dead in space." The Zaphirian ships moved closer, their weapons still trained on the crippled human vessel. The lead ship sent another message. "Surrender immediately and prepare to be boarded. Any resistance will result in your immediate destruction." Sarah looked around the bridge at her crew. They were young, dedicated people who had joined the exploration service to see the galaxy and help make it a better place. Now they were about to become prisoners, or worse, because they had tried to do the right thing. "All hands, this is the captain," Sarah announced over the ship's communication system. "Prepare for boarding. Destroy all sensitive data and equipment. Remember your training, remember your duty, and remember that the truth about what we found here must reach Earth." The Zaphirian boarding parties cut through the hull with energy torches. Armed soldiers in battle armor moved through the ship, rounding up the crew. Sarah and her officers were taken to the bridge and forced to their knees. The Zaphirian commander who entered the bridge was different from the one on the screen. This one was older, with more scars and a harder look in his eyes. He examined the destroyed equipment and the empty data cores with obvious displeasure. "Where is your data on our operations?" he demanded. "What operations?" Sarah replied. "We detected some unusual energy readings and came to investigate. We found nothing of interest." The commander struck her across the face with the back of his hand. The blow was hard enough to split her lip and make her ears ring. "Do not lie to me, human. We know you scanned our facilities. Where is the data?" "There is no data," Sarah said, spitting blood. "You destroyed our computers when you attacked us." The commander studied her for a long moment, then gestured to his soldiers. "Take them to the planet. Put them with the other workers. Perhaps some time in the camps will make them more cooperative." Sarah and her crew were loaded onto a transport ship and taken down to the planet's surface. The journey gave her time to see more of the operation from above. The scale was incredible. There were dozens of camps, hundreds of mining sites, and thousands of ships moving back and forth between the planet and space. The transport landed at one of the larger camps, and Sarah got her first close look at the horror the Zaphirians had created. The buildings were crude metal structures, overcrowded and poorly maintained. Armed guards walked the perimeters, and high-energy fences kept the prisoners inside. The camp commander, another Zaphirian, looked at the new arrivals with interest. "Ah, the troublesome humans. I have special accommodations for you." Sarah and her crew were separated from each other and thrown into different sections of the camp. Sarah found herself in a barracks building with 50 other prisoners from a dozen different species. The conditions were terrible. The building was hot, overcrowded, and dirty. There was barely enough food and water for everyone, and medical care was non-existent. But what shocked Sarah the most was meeting the other humans in the camp. There were hundreds of them, taken from colonies and ships across human space. Some had been prisoners for years, working in the mines and factories while their families back home believed they were dead or missing. An older human man named Robert Chen, no relation despite the shared name, had been in the camp for 3 years. He had been the captain of a merchant vessel that had been attacked and captured while carrying supplies to a frontier colony. "They've been doing this for decades," Robert told Sarah quietly as they sat in the barracks after their first day of forced labor in the mines. "Taking people from the outer colonies where no one will notice right away. The Zaphirians sell us to other species because humans can work in almost any environment." "How many camps are there?" Sarah asked. "On this planet alone? Maybe 20, but they have operations across dozens of systems, thousands of camps, millions of prisoners. It's the biggest slave operation in the galaxy, and it's been growing every year." Sarah felt sick. The law that humanity held most sacred was being violated on a massive scale, and no one back home even knew it was happening. The Zaphirians had been careful, taking people from places where they wouldn't be missed immediately, bribing local officials to look the other way, and using their political influence to keep major governments from investigating. "We have to get word out," Sarah said. "Earth has to know what's happening here." Robert shook his head sadly. "How? We're trapped here, and even if we could escape, the Zaphirians own the local governments. No one will listen to escaped prisoners with no proof." But Sarah refused to give up hope. Somewhere out there, her probe was still traveling toward human space, carrying the evidence of what the Zaphirians were doing. The data would reach Earth eventually, and when it did, the response would be swift and terrible. The Terran Federation had only one law, but it was a law written in the blood and suffering of Earth's history. Humanity had learned the hard way what happened when people were treated as property, and they had sworn never to let it happen again. The Zaphirians had broken that law. They had taken human citizens, enslaved them, and sold them like animals. They had built an empire on the suffering of millions of sentient beings, including Sarah's own people. As Sarah lay on the hard floor of the barracks, listening to the quiet sobs of prisoners around her, she made a promise. Somehow, some way, the truth would reach Earth. And when it did, the Zaphirians would learn that there was a price to pay for breaking humanity's sacred law. The price would be paid in blood. Admiral Marcus Rodriguez stood in his office at Zephr Prime, staring at the report on his desk. The probe from the Defiant Dawn had finally reached human space after 6 weeks of travel. The data it carried was horrifying beyond belief. Marcus had served in the Terran Navy for 35 years. He had fought pirates, explored unknown systems, and helped establish colonies on distant worlds. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he was reading now. The evidence was overwhelming. Detailed scans, photographs, and sensor readings showed massive slave operations across multiple star systems. Hundreds of thousands of beings from dozens of species were being held in brutal conditions, forced to work in mines and factories, and among them were thousands of humans. "Sir?" His aide, Commander Lisa Park, entered the office. "We've received more information from our intelligence networks. 3 more ships have gone missing in the outer systems, all in areas where we now know the Zaphirians operate." Marcus nodded grimly. The pattern was becoming clear. For years, the Zaphirians had been systematically capturing ships and raiding colonies in remote areas. They had been careful to target places where people wouldn't be missed immediately, where local authorities could be bribed or intimidated into silence. "What's the status of diplomatic contact?" Marcus asked. "Ambassador Johnson made formal inquiries yesterday," Park replied. "The Zaphirian government denies any knowledge of slave operations. They claim the Defiant Dawn was destroyed for violating their territorial boundaries and refusing to leave when ordered." Marcus felt his anger rising. The Zaphirians weren't just operating slave camps. They were lying about it, using their diplomatic status to cover up their crimes. They thought they could hide behind legal technicalities and political influence. "Get me a secure line to Admiral Chen at Fleet Command," Marcus ordered. 5 minutes later, Marcus was speaking directly to the head of the Terran Navy. Admiral Elizabeth Chen, no relation to Captain Sarah Chen, listened carefully as Marcus briefed her on the situation. "The evidence is undeniable," Marcus concluded. "The Zaphirians have been operating the largest slave network in known space. They've captured thousands of our people and are holding them in conditions that violate every principle of civilized behavior." "I understand your anger, Marcus," Admiral Chen replied, "but we have to be careful here. The Zaphirian Syndicate is one of the most powerful political entities in this sector. They have influence with the Galactic Trade Council, the Interspecies Defense Alliance, and dozens of other organizations. If we move against them without absolute proof—" "We have absolute proof," Marcus interrupted. The data from the Defiant Dawn is completely reliable. Captain Sarah Chen and her crew died trying to get this information to us. The Zaphirians are claiming the data is fake, Admiral Chen said. They say it's part of a human conspiracy to damage their reputation and steal their mining rights. Some of the other major powers are starting to believe them. Marcus stared at the wall of his office where portraits of famous naval officers looked down at him. These were men and women who had fought to protect human dignity and freedom across the galaxy. They would never have tolerated what was happening now. What are our options? Marcus asked. The Senate is meeting tomorrow to discuss the situation, Admiral Chen replied. But the political advisors are recommending economic sanctions rather than military action. They're afraid that a war with the Zaphirians could destabilize the entire sector. Marcus felt his heart sink. Economic sanctions would do nothing to help the people suffering in those camps right now. While politicians argued and diplomats made speeches, thousands of humans would continue to suffer as slaves. The next day, Marcus sat in the Senate gallery and watched as Earth's leaders debated the fate of their captured citizens. Senator Williams from the Colonial Committee stood at the podium, making the case for a military response. The evidence is clear, Senator Williams declared. Our people are being held as slaves in violation of our most fundamental law. We have a moral obligation to rescue them and punish those responsible. But Senator Harrison from the Trade Committee disagreed. Military action against the Zaphirian syndicate would be an act of war, he argued. It could lead to a conflict that spreads across dozens of star systems. The economic damage alone could set back human expansion by generations. Other senators voiced their concerns. The Zaphirians had powerful allies. Their trade networks supplied critical resources to human colonies. A war could mean shortages of food, medicine, and industrial materials for millions of people. Marcus watched the debate with growing disgust. These politicians were talking about trade routes and economic stability, while human beings were being tortured and worked to death in alien slave camps. They were putting money ahead of human lives, politics ahead of principle. The final vote was 127 to 98 in favor of economic sanctions. No military action would be taken. Instead, Earth would impose trade restrictions and demand the return of captured humans through diplomatic channels. Marcus left the Senate building that night knowing that the sanctions would be useless. The Zaphirians would ignore them, just as they had ignored previous diplomatic protests. The slave operations would continue, and more humans would suffer and die while politicians made speeches about the importance of peaceful solutions. That night, Marcus sat in his apartment and wrote his resignation letter. After 35 years of service, he could no longer serve a government that would abandon its own people for the sake of political convenience. But before he submitted his resignation, Marcus sent out a coded message through secure military channels. The message went to trusted officers throughout the fleet, to colony defense forces, to merchant marine captains, and to anyone else who might be willing to act when their government would not. The message was simple. The law has been broken. Justice will be served. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, Marcus was receiving replies from ship captains, colonial militias, corporate security forces, and even retired military officers. They all wanted to know one thing. What could they do to help? Marcus realized that he wasn't alone. Across human space, there were thousands of people who shared his anger and his determination to act. These were people who understood that some principles were worth fighting for, regardless of the political consequences. 3 days later, Marcus officially resigned from the Terran Navy. His resignation letter was brief and to the point. I can no longer serve a government that values political convenience over human freedom. The sacred law of our people has been broken, and if our leaders will not act, then citizens must. The resignation caused a sensation in the media. Admiral Marcus Rodriguez was a war hero, a respected leader who had served with distinction for decades. His public criticism of the Senate's decision to pursue sanctions instead of military action sparked protests across dozens of human worlds. But Marcus wasn't interested in protests or politics. He was interested in action. Using his personal savings and donations from supporters, he purchased a small fleet of civilian ships and began recruiting volunteers. He called his organization the Liberators, and their mission was simple: find and free every human being held in slavery anywhere in the galaxy. The Liberators operated outside official government channels, but they had widespread support among human civilians. Ship captains volunteered their vessels. Colonial militias provided weapons and supplies. Scientists and intelligence officers shared information about Zaphirian operations. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a xenobiologist whose daughter had disappeared during a research expedition in Zaphirian space, became the Liberators' chief intelligence coordinator. She used her contacts in the scientific community to gather information about slave operations throughout the galaxy. What Dr. Vasquez discovered was even worse than what the Defiant Dawn had found. The Zaphirian slave network operated across more than 50 star systems. They had captured people from hundreds of different species, but humans were their preferred targets because of their adaptability and intelligence. "They've been planning this for decades," Dr. Vasquez reported to Marcus during one of their secret meetings. "The slave operation isn't just a profitable side business for them. It's the foundation of their entire economy. Everything they've built, all their wealth and power, comes from the suffering of enslaved beings." The Liberators began with small operations. Single ships would infiltrate Zaphirian space, locate slave transport vessels, and free the prisoners. These early missions were dangerous and difficult, but they were successful. Hundreds of people were rescued and brought back to human space, but each successful mission revealed new horrors. The slaves rescued by the Liberators told stories of torture, medical experiments, and deliberate starvation. Children were separated from their parents and sold to different buyers. Sick and injured slaves were simply left to die. Captain Sarah Chen, who had managed to escape from the camp on Kepler 442c along with several other prisoners, joined the Liberators and became one of their most effective field commanders. Her first-hand knowledge of Zaphirian operations made her invaluable in planning rescue missions. "They think they're untouchable," Sarah told Marcus after her first successful raid. "The Zaphirians believe that political pressure will protect them from any real consequences. They don't understand what they've unleashed, but the Zaphirians were learning." As Liberator raids became more frequent and successful, the aliens began to respond with increasing brutality. For every slave ship that was liberated, they executed dozens of prisoners in retaliation. Guards at the slave camps became more violent, and escape attempts were punished with death. The situation reached a new level of horror when the Zaphirians attacked the human agricultural colony of New Kansas. The planet had been completely neutral in the conflict, with no connection to the Liberators. But the Zaphirians invaded anyway, capturing the entire population of 2.3 million people. The message from the Zaphirian leadership was broadcast across human space. "For every slave you free, we will take 10 humans in return. Continue your illegal activities, and we will reduce every human colony to ashes." The attack on New Kansas finally broke the political deadlock on Earth. Public outrage was so intense that the Senate had no choice but to act. By a vote of 201 to 24, they declared the Zaphirian Syndicate a hostile entity and authorized unlimited military action. Admiral Rodriguez was recalled from his exile and given command of the largest naval force in human history. The official Terran Navy would join with the Liberator fleet to form a combined armada of over 3,000 ships. As Marcus stood on the bridge of his new flagship, the dreadnought Righteous Fury, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. It had started with a simple principle: no sentient being should be enslaved. That principle had cost him his career, his comfortable life, and nearly everything he owned. But it had also given him something far more valuable: the knowledge that he was fighting for something truly important. The coming war would be brutal and costly. Many good people would die, but they would die fighting to protect the most fundamental right of all thinking beings, the right to be free. The Zaphirians had broken humanity's sacred law. They had enslaved humans, tortured them, and threatened to destroy entire colonies. They had built an empire on suffering and called it civilization. Now they would learn that there were some lines that should never be crossed. They would learn that humanity, when finally roused to anger, was capable of terrible vengeance. The war was about to begin, and it would not end until every chain was broken and every slave was free. The price would be paid in blood, but justice would be served. The message from Admiral Rodriguez spread through human space like wildfire. Within days, merchant captains were altering their shipping routes to carry supplies to Liberator bases. Colonial militias were volunteering entire units for rescue operations. Corporate security forces were donating ships and weapons. Even pirates and smugglers were offering their services to the cause. Captain Jake Morrison had been smuggling goods through the outer systems for 15 years. He knew every hidden route, every quiet port, and every corrupt official who could be bought for the right price. When he received Rodriguez's coded message, he didn't hesitate. His ship, the Swift Current, became part of the growing Liberator fleet. "This is bigger than anything I've ever seen," Jake told his crew as they prepared for their first mission. "Half the merchants in the sector are working with us now. The other half are too scared of the Zaphirians to get involved." The Liberators had evolved from a small group of volunteers into something resembling a professional military force. They had their own intelligence network, their own supply lines, and their own command structure. Dr. Elena Vasquez had become their chief strategist, using her scientific contacts throughout the galaxy to map the entire slave trade network. The scope of what Dr. Vasquez discovered was staggering. The Zaphirian slave operation wasn't just limited to a few star systems. It was a galactic network that touched nearly every inhabited region of space. There were supply routes that connected dozens of systems, processing centers where slaves were sorted and sold, and markets where buyers came from across the galaxy to purchase human beings. "Look at this," Dr. Vasquez said, showing Marcus a holographic map of the galaxy during one of their planning sessions. Red lines showed slave transport routes, while red dots marked known camps and processing centers. The map was covered in red. They've been building this network for over 50 years. It's not just an economic system for them. It's the foundation of their entire civilization. Marcus studied the map with growing anger. Every red dot represented thousands of suffering beings. Every red line represented ships full of people being transported like cargo to unknown fates. The Zaphirians hadn't just violated human law. They had built an entire society based on the suffering of others. "What about their buyers?" Marcus asked. "Who's purchasing these slaves?" "That's the really disturbing part," Dr. Vasquez replied. "It's not just one or two species. We've identified buyers from at least 40 different civilizations. Some are using slaves for manual labor, others for domestic service, and some—" She paused, her face showing disgust. "Some are buying humans for entertainment purposes." Marcus felt his stomach turn. The idea of human beings being purchased for the amusement of alien creatures was almost too horrible to contemplate, but it explained why the Zaphirians had been so successful for so long. They weren't just selling to a few criminal organizations. They were supplying a galactic market for slave labor. Captain Sarah Chen entered the briefing room, still bearing the scars from her time in the Zaphirian camps. She had become one of the Liberators' most effective field commanders, leading dozens of successful rescue missions. "We need to talk about tactics," Sarah said, taking a seat at the conference table. "The Zaphirians are getting smarter. They're increasing security on their transport ships and moving operations to more heavily defended systems." "What are you recommending?" Marcus asked. "We need to hit them harder and faster," Sarah replied. "Instead of targeting individual ships, we need to attack their infrastructure. Take out their processing centers, destroy their supply depots, and eliminate their command posts." Dr. Vasquez nodded in agreement. "Sarah's right. Our intelligence shows that they have 3 major command centers that coordinate operations across entire sectors. If we could eliminate those centers, it would cripple their ability to move slaves efficiently." Marcus considered their recommendations. The Liberators had been successful with small-scale raids, but they hadn't yet attempted anything as ambitious as attacking major Zaphirian installations. Such operations would require more ships, more weapons, and more coordination than they had ever attempted before. "What kind of resistance would we face?" Marcus asked. "Heavy," Sarah admitted. "These aren't lightly defended transport ships. The command centers are protected by battle stations, minefields, and patrol fleets. We'd be looking at significant casualties. But the intelligence value would be enormous," Dr. Vasquez added. "Each command center contains detailed records of every operation in their sector. We'd finally have complete information about the scope of their network." Marcus made his decision. "Plan the operations. We'll hit all 3 command centers simultaneously. If we're going to escalate this conflict, we need to make sure the escalation serves our purposes." The planning took 3 weeks. The Liberators had grown to include over 400 ships of various sizes, from small scout vessels to converted cargo haulers carrying heavy weapons. The fleet was divided into 3 task forces, each assigned to attack one of the Zaphirian command centers. Marcus would personally lead the attack on the primary command center in the Arcturus system. Sarah would command the assault on the secondary center in the Vega system. Captain Morrison would lead the third attack in the distant Proxima system. The attacks were scheduled to occur simultaneously, preventing the Zaphirians from warning each other or sending reinforcements. Each task force would have to fight its way through heavy defenses, capture or destroy the command centers, and extract as much intelligence as possible before withdrawing. 3 days before the attacks were scheduled to begin, Marcus received an unexpected message. It came through official diplomatic channels from the Galactic Trade Council, the organization that regulated commerce between different species. Admiral Rodriguez, the message began, "The Galactic Trade Council is deeply concerned about the increasing violence in the outer systems. We urge you to cease your illegal activities immediately and return to Earth for negotiations. The Zaphirian Syndicate has filed formal complaints about your attacks on their commercial vessels." Marcus deleted the message without finishing it. The Galactic Trade Council had known about the slave operations for years and had done nothing to stop them. Their concern about violence was meaningless when that violence was the only thing that had freed thousands of enslaved beings. The attacks began exactly on schedule. Marcus's task force dropped out of hyperspace on the edge of the Arcturus system, immediately coming under fire from Zaphirian patrol ships. The battle was fierce and immediate. Liberator ships spread out in attack formation, while Zaphirian reinforcements rushed to defend their command center. All ships, focus fire on the battle station protecting the command center. Marcus ordered over the tactical communications channel. "We need to clear a path for the assault teams." The space around the command center became a maze of explosions and energy beams. Liberator ships darted between larger Zaphirian vessels, using their superior speed and maneuverability to avoid the worst of the enemy fire. But the Zaphirians fought back with determination, knowing that the loss of their command center would cripple operations across an entire sector. The battle lasted for 6 hours. When it was over, the Zaphirian defenses had been destroyed and the command center was in Liberator hands. The intelligence recovered from the center's computers was beyond anything they had hoped for. Complete records of slave operations across 12 star systems, detailed buyer lists, and financial records showing exactly how much money the Zaphirians had made from human suffering. The other 2 attacks were equally successful. Sarah's force captured the Vega command center after a brutal 4-hour battle, while Morrison's team destroyed the Proxima Center and escaped with copies of all the computer files. But the intelligence they recovered brought both good news and bad news. The good news was that they now had a complete picture of the Zaphirian slave network. They knew where every major facility was located, how the transport routes worked, and who was buying slaves from different species. The bad news was that the network was even larger than they had imagined. The 3 command centers had been coordinating operations involving over 2 million enslaved beings across 47 star systems. The Zaphirians weren't just running a large criminal organization. They were operating the biggest slave empire in galactic history. "This changes everything," Dr. Vasquez said as she reviewed the captured data. "We're not fighting a criminal syndicate. We're fighting an entire civilization that has built itself on slavery." The captured intelligence also revealed something else. The Zaphirians were planning a massive expansion of their operations. They had been preparing to launch coordinated raids against dozens of human colonies, planning to capture millions more people to feed their growing network of buyers. Marcus realized that the Liberators had been fighting a defensive war without knowing it. While they had been conducting small-scale rescue operations, the Zaphirians had been preparing for a massive offensive that would have devastated human space. "We can't wait for them to make their move," Marcus told his senior commanders during an emergency meeting. "We have to hit them first, and we have to hit them hard enough to cripple their entire operation." The plan that emerged from that meeting was audacious beyond anything the Liberators had attempted before. They would launch simultaneous attacks on every major Zaphirian facility, identified in the captured intelligence. Supply depots, processing centers, transport hubs, and slave camps across dozens of star systems would all be hit at the same time. It would require coordinating over 1,000 ships and tens of thousands of personnel. The logistics alone were staggering, but Marcus knew they had no choice. The Zaphirians had proven that they couldn't be reasoned with or deterred by limited action. The only way to stop them was to destroy their ability to operate entirely. As word of the planned operation spread through human space, the response was overwhelming. Colony governments offered the use of their defense fleets. Merchant captains volunteered their ships for supply runs. Industrial corporations donated weapons, armor, and medical supplies. But the Zaphirians weren't passive. As reports of Liberator activities reached their leadership, they began to respond with escalating brutality. For every facility the Liberators attacked, the Zaphirians executed dozens of prisoners in retaliation. Guards at slave camps became more violent and conditions for the prisoners deteriorated rapidly. The breaking point came when the Zaphirians attacked New Kansas. The agricultural colony had been completely neutral in the conflict with no connection to the Liberators. Its 2.5 million inhabitants were farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, and their families. They had no military forces and posed no threat to anyone. The Zaphirian attack was swift and brutal. Military transports descended on the colony's cities and towns, capturing everyone they could find. Resistance was minimal and quickly crushed. Within hours, the entire population of New Kansas had been loaded onto slave ships and transported to processing centers throughout Zaphirian space. The message that accompanied the attack was broadcast across human space. For every slave you free, we will take 10 humans in return. Continue your illegal activities, and we will reduce every human colony to ashes. The attack on New Kansas finally galvanized the Earth government. Public outrage was so intense that even the most cautious politicians couldn't ignore it. The Senate met in emergency session and, by an overwhelming vote, declared the Zaphirian Syndicate a hostile entity and authorized unlimited military action. Admiral Rodriguez was recalled from his exile and given command of the largest fleet in human history. The official Terran Navy would join with the Liberator forces to create an armada of over 3,000 ships. The mission was simple: destroy the Zaphirian slave network completely and rescue every human being held in captivity. As Marcus stood on the bridge of his new flagship, he thought about how far they had come. What had started as a small group of volunteers had grown into the largest military force humanity had ever assembled. The Underground Railroad had become a war machine, and that machine was about to be unleashed with the full backing of Earth's government. The Zaphirians had made a fatal mistake. They had assumed that political pressure and economic influence would protect them from any serious consequences. They had underestimated humanity's capacity for righteous anger, and had pushed that anger past the breaking point. Now they would face the full wrath of an entire species that had been roused to fury. The war was about to begin, and it would not end until every chain was broken and every slave was free. The combined human fleet gathered at staging areas throughout the frontier systems. Admiral Rodriguez stood on the bridge of the dreadnought Righteous Fury, watching as ships continued to arrive from across human space. The sight was both inspiring and sobering. Over 3,000 vessels of every size and type, from massive battleships to converted cargo haulers, all united by a single purpose. Captain Sarah Chen approached, carrying the final tactical briefing. Her face was grim as she handed Marcus the datapad containing their target assignments. The intelligence teams have confirmed the locations of 847 Zaphirian facilities across 47 star systems, she reported. Slave camps, processing centers, transport hubs, command posts, and military installations. We'll be hitting all of them simultaneously. Marcus reviewed the operational plan one more time. Operation Broken Chains was the largest military operation in human history. Every major fleet in the Terran Navy was involved, supported by colonial defense forces, corporate security fleets, and the volunteer ships of the original Liberators. What's our estimate for rescued prisoners? Marcus asked. Conservatively, over 8 million beings from dozens of species, Sarah replied. But Marcus, the resistance is going to be fierce. The Zaphirians have had time to prepare since New Kansas. They know we're coming. Dr. Elena Vasquez joined them on the bridge, carrying her own set of reports. The xenobiologist had become the operation's chief intelligence coordinator, and her network of contacts had provided crucial information about Zaphirian defenses. The latest intelligence suggests they've been moving their most valuable slaves to heavily fortified facilities, Dr. Vasquez reported. They're using our own people as human shields, hoping we'll hesitate to attack installations where large numbers of humans are being held. Marcus felt his anger rise. Even now, facing the largest military force humanity had ever assembled, the Zaphirians were still thinking like slavers. They couldn't conceive of an enemy that would risk everything to save people they had never met. They still don't understand what they're facing, Marcus said quietly. They think we're like them, that will sacrifice principle for convenience. They're about to learn otherwise. The first phase of Operation Broken Chains began at 0800 hours Galactic Standard Time. Across 47 star systems, human ships dropped out of hyperspace and immediately engaged Zaphirian defenses. The attacks were coordinated to prevent any facility from warning the others, but even so, the fighting was intense from the very beginning. Marcus led the primary assault force against the Zaphirian stronghold in the Kepler system, the same system where Captain Sarah Chen had first discovered the slave operations months earlier. The irony wasn't lost on him. They were returning to where it all began, but this time they came not as explorers but as liberators backed by the full might of human civilization. The battle for Kepler 4042c was brutal. The planet was now ringed with orbital defense platforms and protected by a fleet of Zaphirian warships. The aliens had learned from previous encounters and had prepared formidable defenses. All ships, spread out and engage at maximum range, Marcus commanded. Priority targets are the orbital platforms. We need to clear a path for the landing forces. The space around the planet erupted in explosions and energy beams. Human ships darted between the massive Zaphirian defense platforms, their smaller size and superior maneuverability, allowing them to avoid the worst of the enemy fire. But the defenders fought back with desperate determination, knowing that the loss of this system would signal the beginning of the end for their empire. The battle raged for 8 hours. When the orbital defenses were finally destroyed, landing ships descended to the planet's surface while the fleet engaged the remaining Zaphirian ships. Marcus watched from the bridge as tactical reports streamed in from across the planet. Landing Force Alpha has secured the primary slave compound, came the report from Colonel Williams, commanding the ground assault. Estimate 12,000 prisoners of various species, including approximately 3,000 humans. Landing Force Beta is encountering heavy resistance at the secondary compound, reported Colonel Rodriguez, the Admiral's own nephew. The Zaphirians have fortified positions throughout the facility, requesting immediate air support. The ground fighting was even more brutal than the space battle. The Zaphirians had turned many of the slave compounds into fortresses, using the prisoners as human shields while they fought from heavily defended positions. Human soldiers had to advance carefully, trying to avoid harming the very people they had come to save. But gradually, compound after compound fell to the human assault forces. The sight that greeted the liberating troops was worse than anything they had been prepared for. The conditions in the camps were horrific beyond description. Prisoners were crammed into buildings designed for half their number. Medical care was non-existent. Food and water were rationed to starvation levels. Dr. Marcus Webb, the fleet's chief medical officer, had accompanied the landing force to provide immediate care for rescued prisoners. His first report to Admiral Rodriguez was barely coherent. "Admiral, the conditions here. I've never seen anything like it," Dr. Webb transmitted from the planet's surface. "We're dealing with severe malnutrition, untreated diseases, and psychological trauma on a scale I can't adequately describe. Some of these people have been prisoners for years." As reports came in from other systems, a pattern emerged. The Zaphirians had been systematically degrading conditions in their slave facilities for months, apparently as a form of collective punishment for the Liberator raids. Prisoners who had once been valuable assets were now being treated as disposable resources. The discovery that enraged the human forces most was the processing centers. These were facilities where newly captured slaves were prepared for sale to different buyers. The preparation process involved medical examinations, psychological conditioning, and in some cases, surgical modifications to make the slaves more suitable for specific types of work. Captain Morrison, leading the assault on the processing center in the Vega system, sent a report that made Admiral Rodriguez physically sick. "Admiral, they've been performing experimental surgeries on human children trying to enhance their physical capabilities for buyers who want stronger workers. Some of these kids are barely 10 years old. The human forces fought with a fury that surprised even their enemies. Soldiers who had trained for conventional warfare found themselves in situations that demanded every ounce of their moral strength. The sight of what the Zaphirians had done to innocent people transformed disciplined military units into avenging angels. But the Zaphirians fought back with equal desperation. They knew that defeat would mean the complete destruction of their way of life. The slave trade wasn't just their economy, it was the foundation of their entire civilization. Without enslaved labor, their society would collapse within years. The turning point came during the assault on the massive slave processing complex in the Centauri system. The facility was protected by over 50 warships and contained nearly 200,000 prisoners from dozens of species. The battle for the complex lasted 3 days and cost the human forces over 40 ships and thousands of casualties. But when the complex finally fell, the intelligence recovered from its computers revealed the true scope of the Zaphirian operation. The files contained detailed records going back over a century, showing that the slave trade had been the primary source of Zaphirian wealth and power for generations. This isn't just a criminal enterprise, Dr. Vasquez reported after analyzing the captured data. Slavery is literally the foundation of their entire economy. Every major Zaphirian corporation, every government institution, every aspect of their society depends on enslaved labor. The records also revealed something else that shocked even the hardened human commanders. The Zaphirians had been planning what they called the Final Harvest, a coordinated attack on over 200 human colonies designed to capture the entire populations for sale to buyers throughout the galaxy. They weren't just planning to expand their operations, Marcus realized as he read the captured plans. They were planning to systematically enslave our entire species. The discovery of the Final Harvest plans eliminated any remaining doubts about the necessity of Operation Broken Chains. The human forces weren't just conducting rescue operations, they were fighting for the survival of their species. As the operation continued, reports of successful liberations poured in from across the galaxy. Hundreds of slave facilities were captured or destroyed. Millions of prisoners were freed and began the long journey back to their homeworlds. But the cost was enormous. Human casualties mounted into the tens of thousands, and dozens of ships were lost in the fighting. The Zaphirians responded to each defeat with escalating brutality. When human forces liberated slave camps, they often found that the guards had executed prisoners rather than allow them to be rescued. Transport ships carrying slaves between facilities were rigged with explosives, threatening to kill everyone aboard if human ships attempted to intercept them. The most horrific incident occurred during the liberation of the slave complex on Zephyr. As human forces approached the facility, Zaphirian guards began systematically executing prisoners in the courtyard, broadcasting the killings to the approaching human ships. Captain Sarah Chen, leading the assault force, faced an impossible choice. If she attacked immediately, the guards might kill more prisoners. If she delayed, the executions would continue anyway, and reinforcements might arrive to strengthen the defenses. Sarah made the hardest decision of her military career. She ordered an immediate assault, accepting that some prisoners would die in order to save as many as possible. The battle was swift and brutal, but when it ended, over 30,000 beings had been liberated, though at the cost of nearly 2,000 prisoners who were killed by the guards. The psychological toll on the human forces was enormous. These were soldiers and officers who had joined the military to protect people, and they were being forced to watch helplessly as innocent beings were murdered by their enemies. Some units began to refuse to take Zaphirian prisoners, executing captured guards and officers on the spot. Admiral Rodriguez found himself facing a moral crisis. His forces were beginning to respond to Zaphirian atrocities with atrocities of their own. The desire for vengeance was threatening to transform the liberation operation into a war of extermination. "Sir, we need to address the situation with prisoner executions," Commander Park advised during one of their daily briefings. "Some of our commanders are ordering the summary execution of any Zaphirian found in a slave facility." Marcus understood the anger that was driving his forces, but he also knew that giving in to that anger would make them no better than their enemies. "Issue orders to all commanders. Zaphirian prisoners are to be taken alive when possible and turned over to military tribunals for trial. We're fighting to uphold the law, not to abandon it." But even as Marcus tried to maintain discipline among his forces, he knew that the war had fundamentally changed. What had started as a rescue operation had become something far more significant. The human species was fighting for its survival against an enemy that had built an entire civilization on the enslavement of others. The Zaphirians had broken humanity's sacred law, and they had done it on a scale that defied comprehension. Millions of beings had suffered and died to build their empire. Now that empire was crumbling under the assault of an enraged humanity, and the final reckoning was still to come. The blood price was rising with each passing day, but Admiral Rodriguez knew that there could be no peace until every chain was broken and every slave was free. The war would continue until the Zaphirian slave empire was completely destroyed, no matter what the cost in blood and treasure. Justice demanded nothing less. The final phase of Operation Broken Chains began with the siege of Zephr Prime, the homeworld of the Zaphirian Syndicate. For 3 months, the human fleet had systematically destroyed slave facilities across dozens of star systems, liberating millions of prisoners and crippling the enemy's economic infrastructure. Now they had come to the heart of the empire that had built itself on suffering. Admiral Rodriguez stood on the bridge of the Righteous Fury, studying the tactical display that showed the Zaphirian homeworld and its defenses. The planet was protected by the largest concentration of military forces the Zaphirians had ever assembled. Hundreds of warships, orbital battle stations, and planetary defense systems created overlapping fields of fire that would challenge even the massive human fleet. Final count, Admiral, reported Captain Chen, 2,437 ships, including the entire Terran battle fleet and volunteer forces from 43 human colonies. This is the largest military force our species has ever assembled. Dr. Vasquez approached with the final intelligence briefing. Her analysis of captured Zaphirian data had revealed the true purpose of their final target. The orbital station designated Zephyr Station 1 isn't just a military installation, she reported. It's the central auction house for their entire slave trade network. Our estimates suggest they're holding over 500,000 prisoners there, including nearly 200,000 humans. Marcus felt his jaw clench. The station wasn't just a symbol of Zaphirian power. It was the beating heart of their slave empire. For over a century, sentient beings had been bought and sold in its vast auction chambers while Zaphirian nobles watched from luxury boxes above. "What's the station's defensive capability?" Marcus asked. "Significant," Sarah replied. "Heavy armor, powerful shields, and enough firepower to engage a battle fleet. But it's also the size of a small city. If we damage it too severely during the assault, we could kill the very people we're trying to save." The tactical problem was enormous. The station had to be captured intact to save the prisoners, but it was too well defended to be taken easily. A direct assault would result in massive casualties on both sides. A siege would give the Zaphirians time to execute prisoners or call for reinforcements. "What about the planetary government?" Marcus asked. "Any sign they're willing to negotiate?" Dr. Vasquez shook her head. Their last transmission was a formal declaration that they would rather die than surrender their economic assets to what they called human terrorists. They're calling this a war for the survival of their civilization. Marcus understood their position. The Zaphirians had built their entire society on slave labor. Without enslaved beings to work their mines, factories, and farms, their economy would collapse and their standard of living would plummet. They were fighting for their way of life, which made them even more dangerous, but they had also made a fundamental miscalculation. They assumed that humans would eventually grow tired of the war and accept a negotiated settlement that allowed some form of slavery to continue. They couldn't comprehend that humanity would sacrifice everything to ensure that not a single sentient being remained in chains. "Open a channel to all ships," Marcus ordered. "It's time to address the fleet." The communication system connected him to every ship in the human armada. On screens throughout the fleet, soldiers, sailors, and officers saw their commander preparing to speak. Many of these people had volunteered for the mission knowing they might not survive. They had left their families and homes to fight for strangers they had never met. "To all personnel of the Liberation Fleet," Marcus began, "we stand at the gates of the empire that has caused more suffering than any other force in galactic history. For over a century, the Zaphirians have built their wealth on the pain of enslaved beings. They have taken our people, our children, and turned them into property to be bought and sold." He paused, looking at the faces of his bridge crew. These were good people who had given everything to fight for what was right. Today we end their empire forever. The station before us contains 500,000 prisoners, including 200,000 of our own people. We will free every one of them, and we will ensure that no other sentient being ever suffers as they have suffered. The channel remained open as reports came in from across the fleet. Ship after ship confirmed their readiness for the final assault. Colonial militias, Terran Navy regulars, corporate security forces, and volunteer crews all united by their determination to see justice done. The battle began at dawn, Zephr Prime time. The human fleet spread out in attack formation, engaging the outer defensive perimeters while assault ships raced toward their primary targets. The space around the planet became a maze of explosions and energy beams as the largest space battle in galactic history unfolded. Marcus watched the tactical display as his ships fought their way through layer after layer of Zaphirian defenses. The enemy fought with desperate courage, knowing that defeat would mean the end of everything they had built. But human determination proved stronger than Zaphirian desperation. Breakthrough on Vector 7, reported the tactical officer. Assault squadrons are approaching Zephyr Station 1. The massive orbital station was a city-sized structure that had served as the center of the galactic slave trade for generations. Its auction chambers could hold thousands of prisoners at once, while its detention levels contained holding areas for hundreds of thousands more. The station's computer systems contained records of every slave transaction for the past 50 years. Captain Sarah Chen led the assault on the station personally, commanding a force of specially trained Marines equipped for boarding operations. The fighting inside the station was brutal and personal. Zaphirian guards used prisoners as human shields, forcing the Marines to advance carefully through corridors filled with terrified civilians. Deck by deck, room by room, Sarah commanded over the tactical channel. Every prisoner we save makes this worth it. The liberation of Zephyr Station 1 took 18 hours of continuous fighting. When it was over, the Marines had freed 547,000 prisoners from dozens of species. The sight that greeted them in the holding areas was beyond description. Beings who had been treated as cargo were crammed into spaces barely large enough for half their number. Many were sick, injured, or psychologically broken by their ordeal. But among the rescued prisoners were thousands of humans who had been captured years earlier. Families that had been separated during raids were reunited. Children who had grown up in slavery saw the sun for the first time in their lives. Adults who had given up hope of ever being free again wept as human soldiers cut their chains. Dr. Webb and his medical teams worked around the clock to provide care for the rescued prisoners. Many required immediate surgery or intensive care just to survive. Others needed psychological counseling to deal with the trauma of their captivity. But they were alive and they were free. The capture of Zephyr Station 1 broke the back of Zaphirian resistance. With their primary command center in human hands and their slave trade infrastructure destroyed, the remaining Zaphirian forces began to surrender or flee to neutral space. But the Zaphirian leadership made one final attempt to negotiate. A transmission from the planetary government reached the human fleet, offering to discuss terms for ending the conflict. Admiral Rodriguez received the transmission in his ready room, accompanied by Captain Chen and Dr. Vasquez. The Zaphirian official on the screen was obviously desperate, his scaled features showing fear and exhaustion. Admiral Rodriguez, the Zaphirian began, surely we can reach some accommodation. We are prepared to offer significant reparations for any irregularities in our labor practices. We can establish new regulations to ensure proper treatment of workers. Marcus felt disgust rise in his throat. Even now, facing total defeat, the Zaphirians couldn't bring themselves to use the word slavery. They still thought of their victims as workers, as assets, as anything except people. You broke the only law that mattered, Marcus replied, his voice cold as space. There will be no negotiation, no mercy, no quarter, blood for blood. The transmission ended and Marcus gave the order for the final assault on the planet's surface. The remaining Zaphirian military forces were quickly overwhelmed by the combined human fleet. Cities surrendered without resistance as the civilian population realized that continued fighting would only bring more death. The liberation of Zephr Prime marked the end of the Zaphirian Syndicate as a political entity. Their government collapsed, their military was destroyed, and their economy was in ruins. The survivors scattered to other systems, but they would never again have the power to enslave anyone. In the months that followed, human forces continued to hunt down the remnants of the slave trade network. Ships full of prisoners were intercepted and liberated. Hidden slave camps were discovered and destroyed. Buyers who had purchased enslaved beings were tracked down and forced to release their victims. The total count of liberated prisoners reached over 8 million beings from dozens of species. but the cost had been enormous. Nearly a quarter of the human fleet had been destroyed in the fighting. Hundreds of thousands of human soldiers, sailors, and officers had died in the war. Entire colonies had sacrificed their defense fleets to support the liberation effort. Captain Sarah Chen, now bearing the scars of dozens of battles, established the Stellar Liberation Corps as a permanent military force dedicated to preventing the rise of any new slave empire. The Corps would patrol the galaxy, ready to respond to any reports of slavery or forced labor anywhere in known space. Admiral Rodriguez retired from active duty, but remained as an advisor to the Terran government. His final act was to establish a memorial on Earth for all those who had died in the Liberation War. The names of every human who had given their life for the cause were carved into black stone, along with a simple inscription: "They died so others might live free." The war had changed humanity's place in the galaxy. Other species that had tolerated or ignored the slave trade now understood that humans would never accept such practices. The single law that governed human space had been written in the ashes of an entire civilization, and the message was clear across the stars: break humanity's law regarding slavery, and face complete destruction. The freed prisoners gradually returned to their homeworlds, carrying with them stories of human sacrifice and determination. Many species that had previously viewed humans as just another ambitious race now saw them differently. They were the people who had sacrificed everything to free strangers they had never met. Dr. Elena Vasquez continued her research, but now her work focused on helping liberated prisoners recover from their trauma and rebuild their lives. She established treatment centers throughout human space, staffed by volunteers who understood that freedom was meaningless without the support to use it. Years later, as Marcus stood before the memorial wall reading the names of the fallen, he reflected on what they had accomplished. The war had been terrible and costly, but it had been necessary. The Zaphirian slave empire was gone forever, and millions of beings were free because good people had been willing to fight for what was right. The galaxy was a safer place now, but Marcus knew that vigilance would always be required. There would always be those who sought to profit from the suffering of others. There would always be those who viewed sentient beings as property to be owned and sold. But humanity had proven that such evil would never go unopposed. They had shown that some principles were worth any sacrifice, that some laws were written in blood and could never be broken without consequence. The war was over, but the watch would continue forever. As long as humans existed among the stars, no sentient being would ever again be bought, sold, or owned by another. That was humanity's promise to the galaxy, sealed with the blood of heroes who had died to make it reality. The price had been paid and justice had been served.